When this man died, his small town discovered he had been hiding a secret worth $8 million. He drove a second-hand car. He wore a coat held together with safety pins. He was a janitor. And he quietly out-invested nearly every Wall Street expert of his generation. In the next few minutes, I'm going to introduce you to three completely ordinary people, a janitor, a tax auditor, and a secretary, who each died with fortunes that stunned everyone who knew them. And then I'll show you the Harvard-educated financial genius who did the opposite and lost everything. By the end, you'll know the single trait that decided who ended up rich, and it is not the one you think. Let's start with the janitor. His name was Ronald Reed. He grew up dirt poor in rural Vermont and hitchhiked 4 miles to school just to become the first person in his family to ever graduate. He served in World War II, came home, and pumped gas at a service station for about 25 years. Then he retired for 1 single year, got bored, and went back to work part-time as a janitor at a J.C. Penney, sweeping floors into his 70s. Nobody suspected a thing. Neighbors saw a quiet old man in worn flannel who parked far from the store to save a few coins on the meter. One morning at his coffee shop, a stranger quietly paid his bill, assuming the old man couldn't afford it. Then Reed died at 92, and inside a safe deposit box, he left a 5-inch thick stack of stock certificates, 95 different companies, and a estate worth around $8 million. His own family was, in their words, tremendously surprised. And he gave almost all of it away, nearly $5 million to his local hospital and over $1 million to his library, the biggest gifts either had ever received. So how does a man who pumped gas die with $8 million? Here's the answer, and it's almost insulting in how simple it is. He bought boring blue-chip companies he understood, names like Procter & Gamble and Johnson & Johnson, the kind that pay you a dividend just for holding them. Then he did the single hardest thing in all of finance. Nothing. He held for decades and reinvested every dividend, buying a few more shares year after year. He even kept the physical paper certificates, which made selling a hassle, so he almost never did. His laziness was his greatest weapon. Now you might think Red was a 1-in-a-million fluke. So let me introduce you to the second person, and watch how the exact same pattern appears in a completely different life. Her name was Ann Scheiber, and she spent 23 years as an auditor for the tax agency, the IRS. She never earned more than $4,000 a year. She was never once promoted, something she believed was because she was a Jewish woman in a place that overlooked her. When she retired in 1944 at age 51, she had about $5,000 in savings and a tiny pension. That's it, a late start, a small income, and a stack of disappointments. But in all those years auditing tax returns, Scheiber had noticed one thing. Almost every wealthy person she investigated owned stocks. So that is what she quietly did. She poured her savings into blue-chip companies she believed in, Coca-Cola, pharmaceutical firms, entertainment studios she loved. And then, just like Reed, she simply held. She reinvested every dividend, she almost never sold, and she ignored every scary headline for the next 50 years. She kept living in the same tiny rent-controlled apartment with peeling paint, wearing the same black coat, walking everywhere to avoid paying bus fare. When she died at 101 years old, that $5,000 had become $22 million. Her dividends alone were paying her around $750,000 a year. She left all of it to a university and a medical school. If any of this is starting to click, do me one quick favor and subscribe, because the third story is the most extreme of all, and it proves you don't even need real money to start. Meet Grace Groner. She worked as a secretary at a company called Abbott Laboratories for 43 years. Back in 1935, in the middle of the Great Depression, she bought 3 shares of her company's stock. 3, for about $180 total. And then she did what by now you can probably guess. She never sold them, not for the next 75 years. Those 3 little shares split again and again. The dividends bought more shares, and that snowball rolled quietly for 3/4 of a century. When Grace died at 100 years old, those 3 shares had become a fortune of $7.2 million, which she left to her old college, $180, left completely alone for a lifetime. 3 ordinary people, a janitor, an auditor, a secretary. No high salaries, no fancy degrees, no Wall Street connections. Now let me show you the other side of the coin because it makes the lesson impossible to ignore. His name was Richard Fuscone, and he was everything those 3 were not. A Harvard-educated executive at Merrill Lynch, an MBA so successful he retired in his 40s. A magazine once named him one of the top 40 business people under 40. Where red swept floors, Fuscone ran empires. And in the mid-2000s, he borrowed heavily to expand an 18,000-square-foot mansion with 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 swimming pools, and a maintenance bill of over $90,000 a month. Then the 2008 crash hit. All that debt turned his fortune to dust. He went bankrupt. "I currently have no income," he told a bankruptcy judge. His homes were foreclosed, and his mansion sold at auction for 75% less than it was worth. And here is the detail that should stay with you. That happened just 5 months before the quiet janitor gave his $8 million away. So think about what actually separated them. It wasn't intelligence. Fuscone had the best education money can buy. It wasn't income. He out-earned all 3 of them combined many times over. The only thing that separated them was patience. Rudd, Schreiber, and Groner spent less than they made, bought pieces of solid companies, and then left them completely alone for half a century. Fuscone chased more, borrowed against the future, and blew up the moment the market turned. That's the whole secret. Not a hot stock, not a genius move. Compounding is simply what happens when you refuse to interrupt growth. A modest amount of money invested in ordinary companies and left untouched for 30, 40, 50 years quietly becomes a fortune, because time does the heavy lifting that no salary ever could. The math is boring, and boring is exactly why it works. Here's what this means for you. You will probably never earn what Fuscone earned, and you don't need to. Because the method that made a janitor, an auditor, and a secretary millionaires is not a secret, and it is not complicated. Spend less than you make. Own pieces of good companies. And then have the patience to do nothing for a very, very long time. Almost anyone can copy the method. Almost nobody can copy the patience. And that, not income, is the real reason most people never build wealth. So the next time you feel behind because you don't have the salary or the degree or the perfect strategy, remember the man in the safety pin coat, the auditor in her worn black coat, and the secretary with her 3 little shares. They prove that wealth was never about how much you make. It's about how long you're willing to wait. Which of these 3 stories hits you hardest? And do you know someone who looks completely ordinary but might be quietly wealthy? Tell me in the comments. And if this changed how you see money, subscribe. Because your future self is the one who has to live with the choice you make today. This video is for education and entertainment only and is not financial advice.